I don't know whether you know Carol Collette, but she's here and she has heard me speak before, and she asked when I said, Carol, what are you doing here again? You're going to be tortured. And she said, I want to see how the talk has evolved. And it has evolved quite a lot in the past day or two, because a friend of mine called Nathan Norris, who's inviting me to speak in New Orleans, says, yes, Jason, you can speak about lean urbanism, but it's got to be fun. I've never heard you be such a drag as on this topic. He literally said this yesterday. And I said, what happened to you? And so the first thing I did is remove half the slides, and most of them that had to do with sort of the nerd stuff of what is it that we're doing in detail, which no one remembers anyway. And mostly that were up there to remind me to speak about all these various things, you know, that were kind of accused to me. So basically I have a visual presentation. It is thinner than the usual presentation because I'm assuming most of you are architects. When you speak to a mixed audience, you have to emphasize many more things. But architects are sort of biased certain ways. They understand certain things already. So this is a little bit biased towards what might interest you. And I don't know whether you're going to find it amusing or not, but I'm going to tell some personal anecdotes, which usually is a pretty good way to start. So, lean urbanism. Those of you who continue to visit our projects like Seaside and so forth, particularly the later ones from the 90s that are now being built, like and almost completed, you know, like Alice Beach and Rosemary Beach and so forth. Those are projects of the 20th century. They were projects of, even though they were actually designed in 2005, 2006, those were still the premises of the 20th century. And we have to remember that the crisis that occurred in 2007 was quite unusual because there was a whole series of overlaid crises. Many things happened at the same time. And I think we could have handled each one of them independently, but they happened to coincide. One of them was the real estate bubble, which I think we all know about. The second one, which happened at the same time, and it's hard to believe, is the consciousness of climate change. Not climate change per se, which, as you know, has been analyzed for decades. And people say, well, you know, it was first identified in 1968. But when Al Gore made his film of 2006, 2007, was the first time that Americans said, well, this is something. And it became part of the discussion. You may be against it, you may not believe it, you may be for it, you might think it's the most important thing in the world, but we weren't even thinking about it before that. And it happened at the same time. And the other thing that happened, I think, which was less important, is how the world actually lost control of our omnipotence in the world. You know, the Iraqi war and so forth. You know, all of these things have a tremendous effect on the psyche of a country. I just want to remind you of something. I was actually speaking to some young people in my office the other day, and I was discussing two buildings which were the most famous buildings of their time, and we loved them. The Yale School of Architecture by Paul Rudolph and Boston City Hall. And the kind of audacity of these buildings, the amazing audacity, how'd you do that? And they said, well, we've never lost a war. Because the Americans were omnipotent, the confidence was absolute. This was before Vietnam, and it was expressed this way. And just a few years after Paul Rudolph finished the building, the students themselves burned it. The building was burned by the students, because things had changed so quickly. And so I think the psyche, the psychological aspect is really what's most important. And I realized that the psychological aspect was permanent. And I'd like to actually emphasize this. Look, the bubble is over, right, from Miami. I understand there's even, I don't know, some astronomical number of condominiums going up. You know, the bubble's over. We knew it would be over. But what it revealed is the underlying, essentially, bankruptcy of the country. You know, between the pensions we can't pay, between having to take care of the baby boomers who are aging and consuming a lot of wealth and so forth. What was revealed that we had no idea about was how broke we were. You know, and when I go to cities now and I speak to the mayor, the first thing I ask them is, by the way, Mayor, when are you going bankrupt? He says, what do you mean when are you going bankrupt? Well, you know, at some point, you know, that the lines cross, that can be calculated. So really, go speak to your financial director. Tell them to figure out date certain when you go bankrupt. You know, when the pensions get you and the taxes don't, and it's over. You know, everything's rising like that. And you can actually get the date. And we didn't know that. Okay, and that is a permanent fall on the culture. It's a permanent, you know, down on the culture. The second thing about climate change, which is whether you think the science works or not. Let us assume that the science is absolutely correct. Okay? Even if the science is correct, and you actually ask people like Liz, you know, my partner, who actually knows what she's talking about, and I say, well, just tell me, I know it's like 6 feet, but what's the date? You know, in my opinion, the confusion comes in because you hear about these problems, but they're all on different dates. Sometimes you're hearing about 2020, sometimes you're hearing about 2060, sometimes you're hearing that the tipping point is 2016. And so the people who are against actually believing climate change say, you know, the statistics are all over the place. Well, the statistics are not all over the place, it's just that people are giving different dates. So then I asked Liz, and I said, okay, Liz, tell me about, no, I don't want to hear about 2060. You know, forget about that. Tell me what's it like in 2020. And then she tells me about the tragedy of Alton Road and everything else. And I said, okay, how many days is that going to happen? And I said, excuse me, but is my car rust-proof? Can I buy galoshes? Because what actually happens is that the disaster is actually very slight. When you give it dates like 20 years from now, it's a little bit, you know, you get big puddles, you get bigger puddles. We already have puddles, you get bigger puddles. The problem is not the physical one, the problem is the psychological one. The permanent problem is that we're going to get spooked. And within a few years, they're going to withdraw the insurance. The insurance companies are going to say, oh, you have a house in Miami Beach, you have a house on the shore, well, we can't insure it anymore. And that is what's going to cause the crisis. And all of these things, all of these disasters that are going on, are actually less than we think physically, and much more psychological. There's a psychological situation that's the permanent psychological situation. And as an urbanist who thinks in the long term, see, architects have to finish their projects within 3 to 5 years. You photograph it, you get out of there, people change the curtains, and then but you got a photograph. An urbanist is 20, 25 years. So you become a kind of student of long-term trends, and you try to figure it out, because that's really it's very different from architecture. The difference is not scale or complexity. Architecture can be very large and very complex. The difference with urbanism is time. You begin to think about time. Okay? So, when 2007 happened, and our office had less to do, I said, let me think about it. Let me think about all the things that we should become for the 21st century. And I actually, you know, classically went off to a little room and thought about it. And the first thing I did is I thought, well, we're going to become a green office. And everybody took the LEED exam. And we ordered new stationery. It's the same old stationery, but I want green ink. And so forth. And then I was in Panama. This is an anecdote that you really have to remember this. I was working in Panama. We had done a project in an area so remote, an island, that it was actually very ecological, because we had to come up with the infrastructure. And the infrastructure, you know, when you start from the beginning, it's always less expensive to make it environmentally responsible, because you want light infrastructure. So this project was a wonderful light infrastructure project. And so in order to get the permit, we went to see the minister, because there's no public process in Panama. You just go straight to the minister. And I was presented as one of the great environmental architects. Not as an urbanist, they said. And here comes our environmental consultant. And I said, wow, I was just promoted. Right? I just done urbanism, right? But was that an urban? And so the guy, who was really pretty funny, he was in a little high-rise, about 8 stories, the window was open. And he comes up, and he pulls out his phone, and goes to the window, opens the window, and pretends to throw it out. And I'm saying, what's going on? And he says, oh, wow, My phone just hit an environmental consultant in the head, and when it bounced off, it hit another environmental consultant. They were crawling in the sidewalks. He was so profoundly unimpressed. And so I said, okay, I got that lesson very quickly. Thank God I got it so early. We all have to be environmentally sound, but it doesn't get you anywhere. It's actually water level. You know, it's expected, but it has no advantage. So then I went back to the drawing board, and we began doing things like studying agrarian urbanism. So we used to grow their own food, not the food part, but the social part. And we wrote a book on that. And then one of my partners wrote a book on the urbanism for the aging population. Scott Ball did that. And then basically what we did is we have a body of work that can be interpreted different ways. And so what we did is we funded people to write books on suburban retrofit, agrarian urbanism, aging population, etc. So, you know, when the time comes to go for a job, we actually say we wrote the book. Sure. Much better than brochures. So we did that, and my conception was that everything was a hodgepodge. There was this and that and the other. There was no unifying sense. And then a year ago, I was lecturing in Detroit, and somebody offered to give me a tour, and I said, yeah, well, you know, I've already done 6 tours of Detroit. It's called the Pornography of Ruins tour, you know, which you get real thrilled seeing the beautiful Beaux-Arts building falling apart, you know. And I had seen that. And I had seen it given by people who had lost Detroit, usually older folk, whose houses were gone, whose schools were gone, whose shops were gone. Their whole life had been erased. My tours had been given by real Detroiters of the old time. And this person was young, Mark Nikita. And he gave me a tour that was completely different. And it was a tour of an archipelago. Okay, if you think of Detroit as an ocean of ruins, there's also an archipelago that's extremely exciting and vital. Literally the coolest stuff you've ever seen. You just can't believe it's so cool. And you have to know where to find it. By the way, it's not small. It's urban scale. And he gave me this tour, and I was absolutely astounded. And the lecture that I had to give that afternoon, all I could talk about was about Detroit. It wasn't even my topic. I said, you've got to go. You've got to get out there. And the people in Detroit didn't know. They didn't know. And what he showed me was this. What he showed me was not these famous pornography of ruined photographs. What he showed me was all this other stuff. And what had happened uniformly is, you know, when you read that they can't afford the cops, they can't afford the meter readers for the water, they can't afford the light to keep the lights maintained, they also can't afford the bureaucrats. So what had happened is that the younger people had discovered they could get things done in Detroit that they couldn't anywhere else. Just think about that. You know, wow, I can go in and renovate a building for myself that it's not only cheap, because by the way, buildings are cheap in Baltimore. They'll give you a townhouse in Baltimore. But then they'll dump so many regulations and things on you, you can't do it anyway. And I know people that it just doesn't work. Doesn't matter how much you give it away, if you add the cost of the regulatory environment, you have to hire an architect. First of all, you have to do a survey of the building because they want to know. It's all drawing. You can't just go there and point and say, can I do this? No, you have to draw it. Okay, then you have to get a survey. Then you have to engineer everything, and you have to architect everything. And you have to get a permit. And you have to call for inspectors. And everybody has to be licensed. And that's the way it is for everything. There is no mode other than the full Rolls-Royce bureaucratic process. In Detroit, there was no bureaucratic process. And the kids came in and did amazing things. And what's amazing is that it's completely responsible. You know, you ate in the food. You know, I ate in one delicious restaurant after another. I didn't die. You know, the kids were inhabiting their own buildings. They were starting businesses. They were starting restaurants, etc. And I realized that something was happening. You know, that was incredibly exciting. And then, here. And then I remembered. This is what I remembered. I too was 25. I was 26. and Bernardo was 25, and Liz was 25, and Lorinda was 26. And you guess what we were doing? We were doing high rises. And the code of Miami was this thick. It was this mimeograph, this thick. It wasn't half an inch thick. And you just read the damn thing and you figure it out. And you figure it out and you did it. And after this one, we did another one and another one and another one, and nobody intervened. The permitting department was single-story barracks in Dinner Key. You know, not this monster building that you go in and you can't find anybody. You just walk in. They didn't even have internal corridors. You had a porch and you walked in and you talked to the inspector and you got it done. It was, and you didn't have to, you know, interview lawyers to see who would interpret the code most beneficially. So I realized something really extraordinary, which is that in the 35 years or 40 years of my practice, the opportunity profile had really changed. And what the young people were now confronting was not what I had confronted. And because it happened slowly, you know, like the frog, the water that boiled and the frog never jumped out because the temperature raised slowly, I hadn't noticed. We grew up with it, with the regulatory regime. In fact, what happened is, those who grew up with the regulatory regime became experts in it because it happened slowly. Those who come later, like the young people in my office, when I hand them the code this big, they won't read it. I'm not gonna read this shit. And they're right. They're absolutely right. And so we get the older folks who come in and they can actually maneuver through the stuff because they know it. It's exactly in the reverse what happens with computers. Because my generation came to computers late, we'll never be adequate even compared to the people that grew up with them. See, we have two different systems here. We have a younger generation that is absolutely expert at the electronic media and everything that implies, because they grew up with it, and you have an older generation that is absolutely expert at the regulatory environment. And if we just get together, we could actually get something done. You know, you could make the older folk more efficient, and actually the younger folk would have more opportunity. So that began clicking. I began to remember this. So I remember very well learning codes in urbanism by reading 2 or 3 pages of the Miami Code. By the way, when Liz took down the code, the huge bloated code of Miami, and took it down to 350 categories, it was actually 800. It was, you know, incredible. Incredible what had happened in 40 years. So, and then this was Seaside. Okay, check this out. Okay, this is Robert Davis and Daryl. Do you realize that when we designed Seaside, there was no office to submit it to? We wouldn't have known how to argue. We didn't have the argument for the smaller walkable streets. We didn't have the argument for swales, for drainage. We didn't have the argument for the kind of footings that are hand dug. We would have been wiped out. If anybody had pushed back at all, we would have been wiped out. But there was no one pushing back. In fact, what Robert had to do, the bankers, the loan officer said, you gotta get a permit. I can't give you a loan. And actually, partially, he wasn't done with a loan. One of the great things about Seaside was done with so little debt because nobody would give us a serious loan. The myth is that we actually created and I remember talking about it, I don't know what happened, that we actually had to get the county to hire a bureaucrat to give us a stamp. Yeah, by the way, now, what it takes to permit a project, by the way, and they all love Seaside. So we said, okay, you love Seaside, then why can't we build Rosemary Beach? Oh, because now it will take 5 years to get a permit. And hundreds of thousands of dollars, and all sorts of expertise to convince people to allow us to do what's absolutely in front of their eyes. So you can see the change, this enormous change that has occurred that most people don't notice. Another thing about Seaside too, this was the original downtown. It was actually tables selling stuff under tents. Thanks to Daryl. Daryl would actually go to Walmart, buy the good-looking stuff, and you know, raise the price and sell it. He basically selected out of Walmart the T-shirt and a French, you know, she had a very good eye. And then it became incubated and eventually got to town center. So the whole idea that you incubate things, I was born with. Okay, when I first started doing this kind of development, it was all about keeping debt low. And every decision was made to keep debt low. In the 90s, in the 1990s and the first years of this century, no one was interested in keeping the debt low. The bankers would say, no, we want you to build all the infrastructure in the first phase, because they wanted to give the bigger loans. You see, they made fees on the loans. No one was interested in doing anything economically, anything successionally. They wouldn't look at your project unless the loan was enormous. And so the whole thing, and by the way, because it happened slowly, I didn't notice that. I didn't notice. I just went ahead and said, okay, let's just waste a lot of money right in the beginning and carry the interest and so forth. And it's only because of this kind of crisis that I saw when I saw Detroit that I remembered what it used to be like. Okay, so that's the autobiographical part. Let's see what's next. Okay, now there's a bunch of young people I know, some of them in my office, who are onto this fantastic initiative called tactical urbanism. And at first I didn't pay attention because it was kind of beneath me. Like, okay, so you're going to paint, you're going to put sod on the avenue to prove that it shouldn't be parking, that it looks better with sod. You're going to make a temporary cafe. You're going to actually do a skateboard park and let people use it and prove to the bureaucrats that nobody killed themselves. So therefore you should be allowed. And tactical urbanism, I think, emerged out of frustration from the fact that people that were really were very capable in their mid-20s and they couldn't get anything done. And they weren't going to put up with years and years of getting permits. They just weren't. Mike Lydon, who's the leader of this, and he worked in our office quite a while. Mike Lydon is as capable as Bernardo Fortrescio was. In fact, probably more charming and at least as skillful. So Bernardo was building the Atlantis, and Mike Lydon is doing chair bombing at the same age, putting chairs out and proving there's a cafe. And I looked at this and I said, what's wrong with this picture? Same energy, one results in a wonderful building that puts Miami on the map, and one kind of stirs the block. To prove the very obvious point that you can have a cafe in the sidewalk without killing yourself. And so that got me going in this term, and I started ranting about it. So I realized that the problem with this is, however fantastic it really is, this is guerrilla warfare, it's incredibly glamorous. This is the most glamorous thing going on. And what also happened is this organization, which was the New Urbanism we were associated with, as we grew, the organization became more and more mature, right? We were insurgent. We were an insurgent, rude organization when we were young. We were insulting the traffic engineers. We were fighting the ITE, the ULI. We fought everybody. And then it turned out that the people running HUD and the ITE and all that were us. We actually grew up, and the 30-year-olds became the 60-year-olds, and they're in Washington, everybody picks up our phone. So we grew up with them, and what the CNU does now is they actually are concerned with fundamental reform. Okay? We talk to Secretary Donovan, and we say mixed use should get mortgages from Fannie Mae. That kind of really grown-up stuff. Really grown up with years. The Hope 6 program the Hope 6 housing program was written by, essentially, not only executed, but written, the policy was written by New Urbanists. Like, what happened is we grew up. We really grew up. This is now this second edition is a very mature organization. So between the demonstration tactical projects and what the CNU has become, there's what the CNU used to be. You see how there's a gap there? Which is to say, you get these young people with energy who won't put up with bureaucracy. Can they actually get going with real projects? Because at some point you get to be 30 years old. At some point you get 35 years old, and it's not so cool to be chair bombing or sort of pumping sod and taking it off, from pavement. It's not so cool to do that anymore. And this is missing. We started, and Lean is what happened in Detroit. Basically, the reason pink is the theme is that the basic outcome is what we call a pink zone. which is like a free zone, but a pink zone is an area in which the red tape has been lightened. Get it? Red tape lightened becomes pink. Now, a very interesting thing happens. The young people don't know how to negotiate away the red tape. It's the old folk who do. So you get something to talk about. It's in, the old folk have expertise. We grew up with the bureaucracy. We're experts in bureaucracy. We're the ones who know how to bypass it. We know how to patch it. We know the workarounds. We know all the technology. The young people don't. It's the same way that all our stuff that's computer, that's IT, is done by young people. But we understand that's what the expertise lies. So the young people are always helping the old folk getting the electronics going. The old folk can actually help the young folk break through the bureaucracy. It's an expertise. And so this becomes actually a generational bond, other than just having some kid making a website. Because there's one or two things we know, and unfortunately, we're bequeathing a world which is very dysfunctional, bureaucratic. So this is something that emerged, and I said, boy, as an urbanist, there's nothing more exciting that has something to do with the 20-year-olds, because by the time, if I do an urban community, if I do an urban plan, the 20-year-olds are going to be 45 years by the time it's done. We're talking about entire generations happening. So I've always looked at young people, actually, forgive me for saying this, but when I meet a young person, I always think of them as an old person. Because I have to think of them at 45 and having kids. I don't see, for me, the present is a distortion field. If I think about the present, I can't get anything done. It's all about transcending the present. And one of the things you learn is, among other things, that all your opponents retire and die. Which is why I continually ignore them. And they say, well, you got this old guy running the DOT. I say, so what? How old is he? That's just now. So it works both ways, okay? But I think the empowerment time is what makes urbanism so exciting. Urbanism can actually transcend circumstance the way that architecture can. And it adds the magic of time. Okay, so that's where that lies. Now, at one point, because I never shut up about it, it became obvious that to some people that this should be formalized. The Knight Foundation very graciously and very efficiently gave us a 3-year grant to pursue this idea over with actually a kind of, I would say, very organized agenda. The first year, we collect information. We go all over the country. We have meetings. We have seminars, and we learn both what the problems are and what the solutions might be. And just to give you an example of how exciting this might be, by the way, I've learned of very few problems. Frankly, I knew what the problems were. It's what I do for a living. What I do for a living is bypass problems. I had actually heard all the problems. But what I hadn't heard were some of the solutions that people were coming up with, some of the bypasses and patches. And in California, which has the most repressive regulatory environment in the country, they're way ahead in actually getting past the impediments, the bureaucratic impediments. And so we started picking up some ideas from them. But all over the country, where things have become intolerable, there are people initiating ideas that seem very radical. Like, for example, in Providence, Rhode Island, if an architect seals a project, that's the permit. The architect's 100% responsible. They don't have to submit it to the bureaucrat. The architect says, I meet the code. Now, I want to just emphasize this because this will wake you up as architects. If I were to say, what if in Miami if you were to seal your building, that seal as an architect or as an engineer means that you never had to show to a bureaucrat downtown. You didn't have to present all those extra drawings. You didn't have to go through the extra process because you would be responsible for everything for meeting the code. And then the architect's first reaction is, oh my God, that's really scary, being responsible for meeting the code. I said, guess what? You are responsible for meeting the code 100% of the time. When something goes wrong in a building, it doesn't matter how many approvals you have from the bureaucrats, right? and the lawyer says, I'm going to sue you, you don't call the city of Miami and say, oh, by the way, we have to share this lawsuit. No, you don't even think of it. You're 100% responsible anyway. So why do we have to show it to anybody? What do they do? Nothing. They just remove that. Right? And what would happen is, if all that process that you have to put up with, and all the extra drawings that you have to put up, that, by the way, the contractors don't use the extra drawings. They're just to make sure the bureaucrat has the extra drawings. You know what you could do? You could salary people on site the entire time to inspect everything. So instead of salarying process people and people preparing drawings for processing, you could actually pay for people to be on the site to make sure nothing goes wrong. Totally radical. That's already happening in Providence. Okay, which is amazing. And by the way, that's not so odd. That's what happens in Spain. In Spain, you have the aparejador, you hardly, you know. It's in the Western world, right here, among we English-speaking people. Okay, I'm not talking about weird places like Latin America where anything goes. No, sir, I'm talking about here, in the good old United States, people are doing all sorts of stuff that's amazing. And we're picking it up here and there. Okay? And a lot of it is so clever that it's funny. Like, I could actually show you little signs. Let me just show you another one in California. Okay, you know how difficult it is to meet handicap code? Right? And you destroy the building. Or you have to demolish the building, or you destroy it. Well, in California, they have a sign. I noticed this, and they were saying, there's a little sign that says, we've made the best attempt to get this old building to be handicap accessible. Okay? We didn't quite get it perfectly, but if you press this button, it will help you in. And you ring a bell, and people come out and help you. Wow! Why didn't we think of that? And by the way, who's going to sue you when you've actually made the best attempt? And I have a little photograph, and things like that are happening. Now, here's another one that I found, which is in England, which is very bureaucratic, very, very advanced. They have a new, if you go to England now, there used to be all these signs. Her Majesty the Queen will actually torture you and draw and quarter you if if your dog does this. And, there's all these rules. The rules in the parks. You go to the park and there's 17 rules, right? And it's got these seals all over it. Now they have something called polite notice. Polite notice. Please be kind enough to not let your dog poop on the grass. And that's all over England now. Polite notice. Did you have to get that approved by the city? No. Did it have to be passed by the county? No. It's just something that a human would have done standing there, right? If you had planted a human there that says, this is our park, the kids play in the grass, and we'll let your dog poop on the grass. You say, oh, thanks for telling me. That's the relationship that you find, the polite notice. There's no process, there's no punishment, it's just humans actually interacting. And one of the things we'd like to do is collect these kinds of very light, I would say they're not regulations by any means, but kind of guidelines in which you reestablish human, sort of human contact. Okay, now, with this grant, that happens the first year. The second year, we're going to actually generate some pilot projects. We're going to test it in different places. And the third year, we'll make the tools, and the tools will become freely available. And we have a mission statement, which is like this, what we do. And there's a handout in the back if you want to read about it, what we do. And eventually, after much discussion, we realized that we had to break this down into several initiatives, or what we call platforms, just to get it organized. The first one is lean building, then lean development, lean business, lean green, lean regulations, lean infrastructure, and this is now called lean learning. Okay. Lean building is, there's a whole bunch of young developers and not so young who actually work with buildings of a certain size, and they're experts in staying beneath certain thresholds. Like, for example, there are people who know that if the building is only 3 stories and no more than 8 square feet, and the apartment is not, you can actually do it without an elevator and with only 1 fire stair. Wow, that's interesting. And there are other things like that. that are known to certain people, and they're almost like secrets. And what we want to do is daylight those secrets. Actually make them freely available so you don't have to wait till you're 50 to know them after butting your head. We're going to find what those are. By the way, this is not about high-rises. This is not about urban cores. This is more neighborhood stuff. There's something we're going to speak about which is called the lean scene. There's a whole bunch of things that lean urbanism doesn't do. And we spent a lot of time actually defining what it was that we don't do. Because everybody wants to solve the world's problems. People say, well, what about the poor of the world? You know, what about this? Oh, all that, yes, I know. But other organizations, perhaps even hundreds of organizations are doing that. And one thing lean urbanism does to stay lean is we're not doing anything else that anybody else is doing. We're not piling on. Okay? So what I've built a scene like this, that actually doesn't allow us to go out. Okay? If you want to, for example, really deal with the problem of HUD, fine, go to New Urbanism. They're dealing with it. We're not going out. But we are letting people come in. It's a one-way filter. Like, for example, one of the things that's happened, I'm now writing the introduction to the book on tactical urbanism. And what I can see in the book, having read the essay, is that the tactical urbanists as they age are actually becoming more and more lean urbanists. Because they're not just so interested in demonstration projects, they want to do permanent projects. Well, we don't have a filter that keeps them out. We don't say, wait a minute, stay out. The filter keeps us from stepping on them. We say, they're already doing that. They're already doing that. But anybody who wants to come in, like for example, any regulator at the level of Washington wants to come in and pick out any lean regulation or lean code, they're welcome to come pick it out. So it's a one-way filter on either side. And it's very clearly conceptualized. So with lean building, lean development, lean business, etc., I'm going to actually, as I remember, this is where the lecture gets really long. Because each of these is a world. And they're really pretty exciting. Like, do we really have to go to architecture school for 5 to 7 years and come out with $150,000 in debt and still know nothing? Or isn't there a lean way to learn? And the lean way to learn is called apprenticeship, right? Which has led to much of the best architecture in the world. By the way, what you really want to do is perhaps not be an architect. Maybe you want to be a developer. What's a developer? A developer is somebody who knows design, regulation, and finance. What if we taught that so you became your own client? And that's learned through apprenticeship. There's an awful lot that's learned through apprenticeship. So lean learning is an apprenticeship play. Lean infrastructure is fascinating, yet we built America. Like our great cities were all laid out at the beginning with lean infrastructure that costs a lot less. Lean regulations, it goes without saying. By the way, we're not going back to the 19th century, we're just looking at 1974. Most of us live in houses that don't meet code. Doesn't meet the electrical code. Right? What's the rate of injury and death? 0. So why did we double the cost of renovation because of electrical? So one of the things we're going to do is actually figure out statistically whether people really are being harmed. Are you really tripping? Are you really falling? Are you really burning? Are you really dying? Are you really getting sick? Actually not. And that's going to be pretty expensive. That can't be done under the lean regulation, by the way. It's pretty interesting. What you do is you contract out of it. Like for example, I have a little list. You can't get a rare hamburger anymore. You know that, right? Well, I have a little thing that actually is written by a lawyer that says, please make my hamburger rare, and I hold the restaurant, free of liability. What a lawyer does is remember, the lawyers write the regulations. The regulations are legal documents. The correct way to use a lawyer is to actually tell you how to get out of it. And one of the things that we've learned, when you get old enough, you actually realize you learn how to use a lawyer. You don't use a lawyer to have him tell you what you can't do. That is the wrong use of a lawyer. You go to the bureaucrat and tell you what you have to do. The way to use a lawyer is you say, no, I don't want to hear from you. And I don't want to pay you to tell me what the bureaucrat can tell me for free. I want you to tell the bureaucrat what I need. And when I've seen the real grown-ups operating, they actually, the lawyer doesn't work. I see the young people being crushed by lawyers. Oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. But the old folk here, what they do is they turn around and say, you tell the bureaucrat what I want to do. Okay? And that is an insight that very expert and expensive consultants can deliver, and young people can't afford it. But why not package that? Why not prefabricate it? Why not make a list of these opt-outs, you know, of these pre-negotiated pieces that say, you know, I'm not going to actually quite fix this stair to 42 inches, it's going to be at 38 inches. But so long as I sign here, you know, I can do it. And the lawyer figures out how to do it. So that's definitely one of the tools that will happen. Lean Green was initiated by Steve Mouzon, who's here in the office, and he calls it the original green. And I need to tell you an anecdote, because a lot of this actually, the aha moments for me would be aha moments for you. I was in an English country house belonging to Lord Salisbury. It was Elizabethan. These houses have huge glass windows. Huge glass windows. And I looked at the beautiful Gothic tracery and I said, how do you heat this place? This is England. You know, it's only single pane. And he goes over and he grabs a curtain and pulls the curtain like this. You know, the curtain is heavy, beautiful velvet with marine hardware. Right? And he runs it across and he says, don't you know about curtains? Actually, no. I thought curtains were what you buy in IKEA to make it look good. Okay? He says, don't you know about curtains? So then I went to Lean and I said, don't you know about curtains? Why can't curtains count? Because, you know, I would rather keep my beautiful old window single pane, you know, instead of the triple sort of, you know, U-boat style ka-chunk windows that they have now. And then I'd rather actually have beautiful curtains made this thick by craftsmen. So that if I'm going to spend $3,000 on a window, instead of the window getting ever uglier, the more I spend on it, I can get an ever more beautiful curtain. And instead of actually having a German factory do it, to military technology standards, why don't I have the local loom made? And you know what Lean said? He says, yes, but how do we know that they're going to pull the curtain? See, Lean assumes an idiot in charge. Now you can also say, oh, by the way, how do we know that anybody's twisting the dial correctly? And there's a lot of evidence of the high tech. But what we have to understand is that Lean, which seems so objective, is very, very biased to high tech. It's not neutral. It is assumed that it will be triple glazing. It is assumed you're going to air condition. You're going to air condition. Therefore, it's assumed that it's better if the window doesn't open. Now, it is so rational. It is so everything. Now, what does that do in a place like Latin America? I saw Lean being presented in Argentina, the first presentation of Lean. What it does is the buildings they showed could be afforded by about 1% of the population. And everybody else was an ecological criminal. And I could just see the audience there. And yet in Argentina, people live in buildings this thick. They have people who recycle cardboard, who have carts. They have people who live very tight in buildings, like, you know, probably less than 100 square foot per person. And I said, why can't there be a LEED? I said, this is a high-tech LEED here. That's for North America. You know, LEED in Argentina should be to validate those people that live in buildings that are 3 generations, that live at 100 square feet, and that actually have people that come to recycle. So instead of being embarrassed that your neighborhood has a cartonero, because in Argentina, if you're the kind of neighborhood that allows people to recycle stuff for you before the garbage can come, it's embarrassing. They want to get rid of the cartoneros. Give them a LEED certification. If you have a cartonero who gets 15 LEED points, you've got to be kidding me. So the whole thing is backwards. And by the way, I asked Lee and I said, are you going to do this? He says, no, but we're not going to block you, which is, I think, very kind. But on the other hand, here's something that I've learned. You can do all you want, you won't be noticed unless you actually take on Goliath. David was just a guy, right? He could have killed anybody, but he killed Goliath. Okay, so one of the things we're going to do is actually take on Lean. And that will draw attention to the fact that Lean is highly biased. That will cause the friction. And we're going to be writing Lean standards, not lead standards, but Lean standards that actually take into account that you can do a house that perhaps, for example, here's something that I want. Sorry, but I was told to give anecdotes, okay? Otherwise I get bored. So you're going to comply with anecdotes. I have a carport where I park my car. My car has dark color. Okay, it's a canvas carport. It costs $8 a square foot. When I get in my car on the worst day of summer, it's cool. I just get in, it's fine. No problem. Okay, now, there's a lot of people excited about container housing. Because container housing is a real bargain, right? You get those damn things for $1,300, they're structurally sound and everything. But by the time you're done insulating them to any kind of high-tech standard, you've lost a foot of depth, and it actually costs as much as stick-built housing. That's what every starry-eyed idealist says. They all discover containers, you know, generations of people discovering containers. Oh God, this is it, this is so great. By the time they're done insulating it and doing all this stuff and cutting it and sheetrock and everything, it costs the same as a house. And you don't have the disadvantage of 8 feet. So what happens if you take a container and just put an $8 canvas on top so the sun doesn't hit it in the first place? It works. Now, does Lean count that? No, because of the high-tech bias. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to have emerge, you know, because there are a lot of people really excited about container housing, and it's not delivering on the promise of affordable anything. It's just not delivering. It's just miserable little places because they're not actually allowed to think of the low-tech solution, which is shade. And so that's the thinking. Lean business, what does it take to start a business? A lot of people, and this comes up with something. Okay. Miami has really been formative for me. When I hear that an immigrant is coming to one of my construction sites, right, Haitian, just that still speaks French, somebody just out of Nicaragua, I say, thank God. You know, they really know how to build. These people really know how to build. Immigrants are the best people building in Miami. Why? Because they all come from countries in which even the middle class doesn't buy housing. They're not developers. The developers are for the upper middle class. Everybody south of us builds their own housing. It's astounding. People that can build their own houses, they come here and they become somebody's carpenter or somebody's sheetrocker. Why not get that skill set that allows them to build the entire house and barter the plumbing and barter the electricity, the stuff that you see right here, northwest of the hospital, at least years ago, northwest of the hospital, there's a huge amount of gray activity by people who cannot do it legally because they can't get through the bureaucracy. They can't read the code, they can't get the regulators, they can't get the surveyors, they can't do anything, so they go ahead and do it. What we'd like to do is within the limits of size, etc., is enable the immigrants. So, Lean is addressed to the millennials, essentially to the young people, to the immigrants, and then there's another phenomenon which is very clear to me. Is there's a bunch of boomers retiring with huge skills and a lot of extra time. It's an incredible asset. They're not just walking medical jokes, okay? They're incredible assets, these people. And if you can get them together to actually break through from their experience for the young people. And so, when we got together, with the way we're working this is we're targeting it to, you know, what a hodgepodge. Millennials, immigrants, and essentially retired baby boomers. You know, and there's a lot of multiplier there. By the way, all of them. Here's just an anecdote. Where was I? And I was thinking, in Birmingham, Michigan, they were opening a lot of restaurants. And I was thinking that a young person, if you give $100,000 to a young person, they'll open 3 restaurants. If you give $100,000 to somebody my age, they'll buy a consultant to tell them how to open a restaurant. The young people have fantastic multipliers. They're a fantastic multiplier. You give them $20,000, and they'll do amazing things with $20,000. If you give $20,000 to somebody over 50, they won't even get out of bed to get up to the check. And so it's very important to actually give multipliers to the young people. Now the problem with the young people, which is very different from my time, they're all in debt when they got out of college. We didn't graduate with college debt. So you could work it off by working at the dining hall, etc. So one of the things we need to do is to, well, that's actually at the level of policy, but you need to enable people where they still have the energy of being young to do the amazing multiplier that they do when you have energy. And so we're very much addressing them. By the way, a lot of these things that I'm saying are not without controversy. Because these days you can't actually target or even, you can't even say millennial. You know, everything's politically incorrect. What the hell is it? I haven't got time. I haven't got time to remember how to say it properly, actually. And then lean development, we worked with something, we invited 13 fabulous developers. And he's going to come up with something called a developer in a box. Developer in a box. I said, what the hell is that? He said, you're never going to find a single person that has all the skill sets. Okay? Because the guy that can argue with an electrician just won't put on a tie to talk to a banker. And that's the anecdote he gave. This is the developer in a box. I'm going to conceptualize something called a developer in a box in which I set up 3 roles and 3 kinds of people can get together. The way they do to design a new program or a new app, 3 kinds of people can get together and actually do development for themselves so they can self-employ and get things done. Because I was trying to say, can't we teach it? Can't we teach it? It says, no, you can't teach it. It's actually different personalities. The other thing, by the way, that it's my person, we're going to come up with a bureaucrat in a box. Because they're bureaucrats, you cannot get the same skill set. The skill sets you want are not going to appear in the same person. So one of the things I'm considering now is actually twinning the positions. Literally twinning the position, having an old, experienced person who has seen everything go wrong. And when somebody comes in with an idea, he says, you fool, I'm going to stop you from making a fool of yourself. And then twinning with a person with very little experience, but can identify somebody perhaps of their own generation and say, no, that kid knows what he's doing. I'm going to help him. I'm going to get that. And by the way, the key to twinning them is that one is not the boss of the other. That's the key. The problem with getting young people in a bureaucracy, and this I noticed, is that the young people are always the employees of the old people, and you destroy them because you have to do what the old folks say. So one of the things we'd like to do when we do our first lean scan, which is to set up the first pink zone, is actually get the key bureaucrats, not remove them. There's a lot of value there. They're impossible to remove usually anyway. But just hire an additional bureaucracy that consists of a very young person that has a totally different skill set and they consult with each other. But the main thing is that the young person is not the boss of the old person, or the old person is not the boss of the young person. So they actually have to work it out. And by the way, when you come in, you can either go to the old guy or the young guy. See which one processes you the best. And they must consult with each other if necessary. That's the kind of idea that we want to experiment with. Because just the reform of bureaucracy is a generational problem. Before we get a bureaucracy that actually is responsive, you have to establish a 3-to-1 ratio of 3 young, open-minded people to 1 old, experienced, negative person. And it takes years before they actually gain power. And you can't wait. So I think this idea of twinning is actually what I call a bureaucracy in a box. Anyway, that's next. This isn't going very quickly. These are this is in Miami. This is tactical urbanism. Wonderful under the highway. You may have attended this. This kind of thing. So, who we want, it is exactly these people who actually have a part to play. But we're not asking these people to deal with the bureaucracy. It's like, nobody asked me to fix my computer. Okay, that's just ludicrous. I'm not going to ask this person here to actually deal with the, the International Building Code and how to get past it. It's not something that she can do. Okay, so that's a young person. And then the immigrant, look at that guy. What do you think he can do? Do you think all he can be is a carpenter? I'm sorry, he can build a whole house all by himself, and probably has back in Nicaragua. We've got to enable these people. This is the solution to a lot of the affordable housing problem, is enabling these people to work. And then finally, these guys, pretty pathetic. but there's a lot in here, you know, that can be used. Okay, now, just to actually confirm what's happened. If you've ever seen a place be revitalized, and we have seen here Miami Beach. When I arrived in Miami, it was Coconut Grove, was revitalized. It was an old hippie slum that was coming up, you know. I think we've all heard of Soho, you know, the old warehouses that were ratty. Key West. Okay, just in my lifetime, I have seen personally Key West be a slum, Coconut Grove be a slum, believe it or not, the downtown, and Miami Beach be such a slum that I only went there twice in 14 years, my first 14 years. It was like, why go there? And what happened was that the young people, the market segment that's called the risk oblivious, people that take risks and they don't care, often thought of as artists or gays, according to Richard Florida. But people who have an eye and say, this is a cool place and it's cheap, they come in first. Because the place is underneath the radar screen, nobody inspects it. Okay, you can go and renovate an apartment in Miami Beach and the inspector isn't even going to look because nothing ever happens there. So they get in under the radar screen. And what they do is they make it cool. Right? That's called, this is the first phase, the risk oblivious, the old name is the Bohemians. Okay? All development was like this prior to 1980. By the way, the left bank of Paris in 1870, Haussmann didn't do anything there. That was the Bohemians who made it cool. This is the way revitalization takes place. The cool people identify it, it's cheap, they make it cool. Then what happens? Then comes the second market segment, second phase, which are the risk aware. They're the developers. Right? The developers, already it's cool, and they can see that they can do it properly. They come in later and they say, I can buy the apartment for this much, I can afford to hire an architect, do the electrical properly, and still have a profit. Right? You know, that can happen. Now, what happens after that? Inevitably, sorry, it's never been avoided. This is what we're concentrating on. You see this guy, the third phase, risk adverse, the dentist from New Jersey. Right now, stupidly, everybody is complaining about this phase. Oh, the dentists from New Jersey are coming. They're actually driving the prices up. It's going to be all Starbucks, etc. A huge amount of energy actually fighting gentrification. Instead of fighting, whatever happened to this person? Whatever happened to this? This is what we have to fight for. Can we actually make a place where the risk adverse can operate, which is what we're seeing in Detroit? Okay, so what happens now? Aha. Okay, when this guy is gone, right, this guy here, and you say, please come into this place and spend all the money to do it right. You know, get the consultants, get the electrical right, tear out the stair until it meets code, handicapped everything. They're coming too early. The place still isn't cool. There isn't a differential. So what have we done to do with this? The public-private partnership. I'm sorry, but when I was 30, when I was 40, 25 years ago, there weren't public-private partnerships. Real estate made money. When did it come up that suddenly developers needed to be subsidized? What's up with that? Whatever happened to the first 3,000 years of Western culture, where developers built the entire world, including all the great cities in the world without subsidy? Why do we need subsidies today? Because we've eliminated the natural organic evolution. If you tell a developer, come in and make our whatever, our downtown cool, well, you're going to give money because it costs this much and it's still selling for this much. But if you let the Bohemians in, they'll take it to here and then you can actually match it. You see? So this is phenomena that the young people wouldn't know. You think that the public-private partnership always existed. It didn't. This is an aberrant phenomenon created by the overwhelming bureaucracy. And so you have to talk to this guy, the banker bureaucrat. It's terrible, and we can't afford it. By the way, if you think people are too young to do things, look, see that house? 26 years old. He was 26, okay? And I want to show you something else. By the way, it's not dangerous to build a house. These guys were 28 and 32 when they built the first airplane. What you find when you look at history is that people are getting things done very, very young. And we know that in the computer industry, but actually in every other industry, it used to be that things were done by very, very young people. Henry Ford. And I have a very long list of slides that I shut down of incredibly young people. By the way, World War II was won by people way under 25. You know, the captains and the colonels were 25 years old. And these are people that we can't even, trust them to build a bicycle without some kind of certification. It's just absolutely absurd. And then we say, well, the young people are infantilized. I mentioned earlier how we had started with Seaside and what we had become. We had become the kind of planners that went for the big loans. Like, we knew that we wanted to lay out the infrastructure, we wanted clients to get the $50 million loan, the bankers were happy. We had forgotten how to do it earlier. But one of the things that I've been alerted to is I've become fascinated by how we built this continent. From the Appalachians west without a banking system and without subsidies. It was an amazing performance. And not only did actually those cities build themselves and house 30 million penniless immigrants without government help. 30 million penniless immigrants without government help. But they created the wealth to, within 2 generations, build the opera houses, the museums, the great civic buildings, etc. How did they do that? And why is it that now we can't even house the poor people? What's up with that? We have to remember that it wasn't always thus. That the affordable housing crisis is actually caused by the government gold plating the regulations and not permitting anybody small to operate. When you go to places like you go with John Norquist and you go to Milwaukee, or you go to Boston and you think about the triple deckers or the Polish flats, people capitalize because they could build their own triple or double apartment. They build their own little housing, and then they build another one they could rent, and then they accumulate wealth, they built another one. There were tons and tons and tons of small developers that did affordable housing. Now, the bureaucracy is such that you can't just build 6 houses in a year that you can make a living doing if you wanted to, because you can't amortize the bureaucracy. You have to talk to Andy Parrish, who's trying to build affordable housing in the Grove and has been middle houses for the Grove residents for the past 20 years. You have to talk to Andy Parrish and see what it takes to get a permit. You have to be a big developer. You can only do 30, 40, 50, 60 houses at a time. Because the effort that it takes to get a permit precludes the delivery system that delivered 30 million housing units for 30 million penniless immigrants. And you have to look at history. Well, these books are fascinating. This one's called Iowa, 1875 or 1874. It's astounding. The book's as big as this table. Wealth created out of nothing. Look at that. 1874, after the Civil War. And of course, what you see is successional infrastructure. They didn't actually put the sewers in right at the beginning. They didn't pave the roads to highway standards. A lot of these buildings were first-generation buildings. They knew they would be knocked down in 5 years or in 10 years. In fact, the Mormons had a sequence. You had to build a sod hut for the first 5 years, a wooden one for the next 5, and then you build a brick one after that. You began successionally, but you began. Totally gone. Now, everything we do is the climax condition. Oh, you want to build a town center? Mixed-use town center? Oh, let's just do a 5-story building. Well, I'm sorry, a 5-story building for 100-foot, 5-story building costs almost $20 million. How the hell are we going to deliver town centers where every 100 feet of one side of frontage costs $20 million? How the hell are we going to do that? Only the madness of the 90s could do that. If you're going to create places, we have to establish successional urbanism. Lean is succession. Okay, what you do is you know where you want to end, but right now you're forced by the code to start with the gold-plated. Right from the beginning, you have to hit all the gongs. It has to be completely gold-plated right from the beginning. Well, no one can do that. No one. And so we're building huge numbers of housing subdivisions without town centers because the town centers are too expensive because of the standards that are done. Impossible to build mixed use, which these people could do. Okay, so this is what I want to talk about. Look at these dates up here. So instead of 1990, we're excited about 1874. That's the new model, 1874. Then there's another model, 1924, Coral Gables. How did this guy do this? Have you looked at the infrastructure of Coral Gables? Have you seen what the first generation buildings look like? Have you seen how he did the landscaping? It's fascinating. A tiny fraction of the cost if you were to build now. You know, this, and by the way, absolutely charming. The best parts are the old one. And then there's 1984. This is what Seaside was like. You know what this thing in the middle was? You know, this famous, that's actually a retention pond for the storms. You know, this was our water system. If I told you the story one at a time, how we built Seaside, first with septic tanks, then with a package plant, then we finally had enough money to connect it to the central, to buy the pipe to connect it to the central thing. And you say, can we do this now? Like, I'm a small developer, I'm 32 years old, I'm like Robert Davis. Could you let me do this? I said, no. You have to get a $15 million loan and connect right from the beginning to the power, but you can't do it the old way. I said, why not? You see, that's what I'm saying. Successional urbanism has actually disappeared. So 1984, by the way, which was a very tough year. 1984 was a very tough, you know, you heard about that. And then, of course, there is 2014, which is Detroit. Detroit is the first of the cities and the poster child of what's going to happen to many of our cities when they go bankrupt. Because we can't afford them. Remember I said that one of the things that happened in the meltdown is they've actually revealed the impoverishment of the civic realm. All these curves are going like that, right? This is the expense, this is the taxes, at one point they cross. There's a date certain. Every city, you ask them, has a date certain when that crosses. And when that crosses, they can't pick the cops anymore. Read the paper with that in mind every morning. Just read the paper. Read that this is happening there, that that's happening there. Just read and you'll see it. Oh my gosh, this is all happening. So we need to study this 2014 and see what it is that makes Detroit such an incredibly exciting city right now. You know, if you went to Detroit and you got the tour that I did, and I've done this with several people, you know what you want to do? You say, I want to move here. I want to move here. It's that cool. There's so much going on. That's fantastic. And by the way, you can dream on about any of this happening in Miami. It isn't going to happen here. It's not going to happen to you. Because you can't get it done. You have to get a big lawyer just to begin talking about it. And this is not what it's about anymore. This is Meisner Park. Just forget about this. Okay? And by the way, what's going on here in Miami, all these condos, forget about it. That's not a lesson for anything. That might end well or end badly, it doesn't matter, these condos, but it's not a lesson for any other place. It's a Latin American aberration. It has more to do with Chavez than with urbanism, okay? You know, what's happening in Miami is what's happening in Miami, but you cannot extract any lesson applicable to anywhere else. It's a little bit like New York. Almost anything you learn about Manhattan isn't applicable anywhere else. It is what it is. So we really have to look at other places. You have to get out of these places. And you know that this kind of place is not to be built again. You can't get the loans for it. This is what I call the lean scene. I'm going on too long. But over here is new urbanism, covering these things, regional planning, global issues, government reform, APA, ITE. Over here is new urbanism. Over here is tactical urbanism, and this is the lean scene. This is what we do. We work at this level, we work at this transit zones, we work at building design, we do semi-sanctioned and sanctioned work. It's about alleviation, not reform. We do not reform the codes. We alleviate the codes. Reform is for the grown-ups to do. Okay, self-funding, crowdfunding, cooperative, pilot projects, light imprint, health and safety, land, you know. So this is the lean scene. And one of the things that we've done is had some really, really rude discussions on the internet, because we have about 100 people participating, and I'm always saying, no, we can't talk about that. That's outside the scene. You know, just so we stay focused, so we don't waste time. And so there's a term that you'll hear called the lean scene. Is this within the lean scene? Because if it isn't, join the CNU, do tactical. And by the way, the same person, I think a good planner today has all three tools. They can do tactical, they can do the real thing with CNU, and they can actually do Lean Urbanism, you know, for presentation. And these are some of the tools. There's subsidiarity, which is to say, where do you work? You know, at what level do you work? You don't work at the level of the region, you work at the level of the city, the block, the neighborhood. That's called subsidiarity. What is it that we do? People spoke about the ethics. What are the ethics of the new urbanism? Sure, you are going to enable a whole bunch of young people to work, or a whole bunch of immigrants, but what's the outcome other than economic? What is this city that we're building? So we took the CNU charter, the charter of the CNU, and what you see in yellow is what's applicable for Lean Urbanism. So there is a vision for a city of a certain kind, although it's not a gold-plated vision. Okay? And then you have, in terms of subsidiarity, this is actually a protocol. This is a pretty interesting protocol in which one of the things we've actually discussed about theory is that when you have somebody oppressing you, right above you, like a bureaucrat, you don't appeal to the bureaucrat, you appeal to the city manager. So one of the things you have to do is you always have to connect the level of application to an appeal one level higher, right from the beginning. Because the bureaucrat isn't going to give you the break, because his job is on the line. Oh, you want to make a step that's 1 inch too short? Well, that's cool. I understand why you're doing it, but it's my job if you trip, right? Because the building inspector's job lives and dies on the basis of very small errors. But you know the city manager, you know how many people trip in Miami every day? Maybe 20. You know how many sue? 3 a week. That's nothing to the city manager. Or you mean a trip and fall? That's nothing. The city manager has no problem with trip and falls. So the thing about subsidiarity is you always try to find the appropriate level to interact. And I've learned this over and over and over again in my own work in charrettes. Whenever we're meeting resistance that's stupid or stupid outcomes is the wrong level of meeting. You know, it's not up to you to actually solve climate change, okay? It's up to you to make sure your mattress gets picked up when you dump it in the corner. That's something we can affect. Climate change, United Nations, no problem. We love the United Nations, whatever, but it's not, we're not discussing that here. Right here we have a problem picking up garbage. So can we talk about this? And what I've learned is that actually in charrettes, and this is actually, we have to come up with a lean charrette. What happens in charrettes is you spend a lot of time, instead of deciding, you spend more time deciding who is to decide. You see the difference? So we have a school. We have to locate a school. Okay, who's going to decide? Is the immediate neighbor going to decide? Or is the neighborhood as a whole going to decide? Or is the city as a whole going to decide? So we have an abstract discussion, like who is to decide. And once you decide who is to decide, then that person can decide. But just having a y'all come in and let's have a decision, I'll tell you, the answer is wrong. Almost always wrong. And if it isn't, it's because you spend a huge amount of time overcoming the fact that you're actually working at the wrong subsidiary level. So we're really interested in subsidiarity, and we want to institutionalize it. Another cut is where you are on the transect. There are lots of things that are allowed in the country. There's lots of things that are allowed in the suburbs that are not going to be allowed in the town core. For example, in America right now, almost every rural area has a code that allows a camp. What's a camp? Well, camp is what guys do. And everybody's very happy that they go off to the camp. And they don't have to meet code. So can we use the camp to allow a whole bunch of things, like building cottages without inspections or with self-dug footings or without insulation? So maybe we use the camp as long as it's a rural area. And a lot of the confusion comes up is when I speak about these things. They say, people are immediately imagining, oh, well, that can't happen. I say, why not? Well, because people will fall down from the 16th floor. I said, I'm not talking about high-rise. I'm talking about two-story structures in suburban areas, no more than six-unit buildings with fire separation. I'm not talking about high-rise. Of course, the high-rise will need to go. And so this idea of where it occurs where there's natural, rural, suburban, general, urban, urban center, urban core, it's very important to actually, this is what we call the cutting tools. The cutting tool is when you take the range of things and you say, where does this happen? What's the scale where this happened? Who decides? So we spend a lot of time slicing it so that we can actually resolve and not get involved in things that aren't our business. Wonderful examples. I don't know whether you've been to Pacific Grove, California. Wonderful full town. It began this way. It began as platforms. You know how it began? You get a platform, and then you build a tent. And then after a while, you build a wooden building, and then after a while you do this, and then you end up being a California city. A wonderful California city called Pacific Grove. That's how we used to do it. Now, you say, I'd like to build a new town. And it begins with a 5-story structure, which needs subsidies, which never gets finished, which is a real problem. So there are all these examples that we have to make well known. Fantastic thing, we discovered that the coolest part of Portland, one of the things that makes mixed use very expensive is when you put it on top of each other. It really is very expensive. You know, the fire stairs, the structure, but you can actually make single-story shops and 3-story walk-ups that are horizontal mixed use that cost a fraction of the cost. If you go to Portland right now, the coolest area is not the Pearl District, which is the famous area where the 6-story buildings where all the yups are. The coolest area is up the hill where it was built in 1870. And this is what it looks like. And we've completely analyzed this. We know that this works. We've met the code. We know what the parking ratios are. We know the costs. Okay, right now, DPZ has known this for a long time. You know, we get jobs because we know this. But we all feel that we need to daylight this and actually make it known that this kind of mixed use can be built even though the standard issue vertical mixed use cannot. Other examples. Then we discovered, I think you all know Auburn's University Rural Studio, right? In which they teach the kids to go out and actually build these wonderful buildings for the impoverished poor. It's a wonderful architecture school. There's a new one called Woodbury University, a real estate studio that teaches 30-year-olds how to develop urban buildings. In 1 year, you get the design, the regulation, and the financing you need, including the color title, the banker likes, so you can actually become your own developer. And they've already had 12 graduating classes. We thought that we would have to invent this, but instead we actually found it. What we need to do is to get, now see what the other architecture. By the way, and you do not get licensed. Please do not get licensed. That is open to your liability. Things like that. Very interesting. And so these are the pilot projects that we're going to bring in. Oh, and then there are fantastic examples. Do you know that 3 months after Hurricane Katrina, the Vietnamese were back? How did the Vietnamese, and you know what the story is? Because the Vietnamese have been beaten up by government all their lives, between the French and the Americans and the commies, as soon as something happens, and Bush says, oh, we're going to give you billions of dollars, the Vietnamese says, let's suck. And the story is fascinating. And when we got there, the Vietnamese were already, we got there 6 months later to work with everybody else, and the Vietnamese were already in place. An amazing thing, totally unknown. But we did study it at the time. We need to daylight this. And actually contrast this, because the entire world thinks it's Brad Pitt, which is subsidized $500,000 houses with subsidies. And they're green and they're everything else, but it doesn't do anything. It's just architectural vanity. But the entire world is focused on this and not that. And it should be focused on this, because that is really lean. We need to refocus that. And then this is Neshoba County Fair, wonderful place that grew over time. And this is a developer nearby who's actually building a downtown. Basically, it's a huge story. His name is Dan Camp. He's been doing it for 20 years. And he builds so well, he doesn't need permits. So that's Dan. We trust him. And he's building this in land that's worth nothing. He's an amazing, really worth visiting. If I were 20 years old right now, and they said, what would you do? I would apprentice to Dan Camp. Exactly where I would go. I'd say, please teach me what you know. That would be the best graduate education there is. You've seen Burning Man. I think it's 10,000 people, or 10,000 10,000 people, 50,000, more like 50. 10 rules. Unruly people getting along perfectly, and I mean perfectly, with 10 rules. That has to be studied. That's going to be one of our pilot projects. And of course, the Mormon way of developing in the West, they built in 50 years, they built 537 towns and cities, not one of which failed. And with virtually no capitalization, including, by the way, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, San Diego. Amazing. How did they do that? And that has to be studied because it's never studied. It's studied as a kind of religious aberration. Brigham Young was the Henry Ford of urbanism. So like I said, no one has built cities like Brigham Young, no one. Okay? He is not a religious leader. He was a management genius. That's what he was. But it has to be understood that way. And he had a method. This is what you do the first day, this is what you do the first week, this is what you do the first month, this is what you do the first year, this is what you do the first decade. Bam, 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 and you end up wealthy. Brilliant work, totally unknown. We need to make that, we need to daylight that. Road making, my brother Douglas was in Scotland, and he was looking at macadam roads that were 100 years old. Mr. McAdam, invented asphalt, right? What we now call here, they call asphalt over there. Macadam roads are still in play 100 years old. There are these old books. One of our engineers is actually looking at the old British imperial engineering. How did the Brits go off with 2 or 3 people and build railroads and highways and cities all over the world? What was that engineering like? I actually met one old British imperial engineer in Jamaica. He was fabulous. He was so economical, he was so lean. But the books are still there. And we've begun to actually study these, by the way, this is a macadam road that's 100 years old in Scotland. Check that out. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's really economical. And we have the prices, we're doing the pricing of the different ways of doing things. So once you get into engineering, you have to get the numbers down. And then we also want to call, by the way, this is Richard Meyer's house in today's New York Times. This is what everybody drools over. Triple glazing, God knows what, this is in Long Island. This is Steve Mouzon's, what's it called, Class 1 house.
Yeah, it's a Smart Dwelling 1.
The what?
Smart Dwelling 1.
This is the Smart Dwelling 1, which was published in the Wall Street Journal. Everything about this is the original green. The old way of doing things. Beautiful. By the way, the thing about the original green is not just that it's environmental and cheaper, it's delightful. It's delightful. You open the window and you get a breeze open. You know, imagine these poor bastards. By the way, the story is that Richard Meyer is upset because she put some paintings in the house. It wasn't even about the idiocy of triple glazing a glass cube in Long Island. But this is the kind of thing that you're seeing now. And, I didn't mean to lead. This, you know what, how much this guy costs? You can still get this for $4,000. There's all this technology, American, pragmatic, Yankee, ingenious technology. There's a catalog in which you buy the lead stuff, and there's another catalog which the farmers use, and the stuff is still made, that is full of wise, old, inexpensive ways of doing tech. We need to give those credentials. Okay? And then you can find places like Findhorn, which is a self-built community in Scotland that began as a protest place when the first B-52s landed in Scotland with the atomic bombs to bomb the Russians. Basically, protesters settled in, and eventually that grew into a permanent town called Findhorn. No permits, absolutely wonderful. There it is. That should be known. Low tech, and of course there's the Cotton District that I showed you in, this is in Starkville, Mississippi, Detroit, Michigan, poster child of things that are happening. You've seen these two. Oh, here we have, by the way, this is Robert Davis incubating a suburban Seaside, and this is Tony Goldman incubating the Windward District. By the way, very, very little expense. Wynwood is brilliant. It is incredible. It's worth a whole lecture how much he's getting done with so little investment. If you want to become a developer, basically, you want to go into a city and get a place to happen, we have the model right here in Miami. Never seen anything smarter than Wingwood. It isn't just, go there with the eyes to see what's going on here, how much is this costing. And that's worth the lecture. This is Las Vegas. Okay, you say, well, this isn't for everybody. Las Vegas with Steve Wynn's pool, that does all this stuff. Have you been to Las Vegas? It's like so expensive. Guess what the cool thing is? The container Main Street. Some guy came in, put a bunch of containers in Main Street, that's where everybody is. It's over, the fountain's over, you've seen the fountain. After you've seen Star Wars, that fountain's going to impress you. Come on. It's over. What's cool is this. It's actually the authenticity of this. And this is a young woman, 24 years old, who builds container bars, beautifully done. And they're all temporary structures because you can't make, the FEMA requirements don't allow you to be on the ground. So how are you going to make a bar? So you sit these containers down and all these things. She knows how to do this. She is our Le Corbusier. She's the youngest architect ever licensed actually, in the United States. Now, you're going to say, well, the world is full. This is a famous inn in the coast of San Diego that couldn't be nicer, couldn't be more famous. I've never been able to stay there. The reservations are gone. These stairs have been there for almost 70 years. No one I've asked, has anybody ever fallen down those stairs? Obviously, no one in code. Has anybody ever fallen down those stairs in 70 years? No. Is there a sign warning you? No. What's up with that? Well, humans are smart. Okay. Now look at this. You say, well, they'll never let you do that. You know what this is? This is called light sport aviation. Back in 1980, people who designed and flew airplanes realized that aviation was not progressing. They were still flying Cessnas from 1955. Okay? It couldn't go forward because the FAA wouldn't allow experimentation. There were too many bureaucrats. So a bunch of engineers got together and said, look, let's establish a threshold. We're going to call it light sport aviation. And so long as we're under, let's say, 80 horsepower, so long as we're under a 20-gallon tank, so long as we only have one passenger, so long as we only fly in the daylight, so long as we have fixed landing gear, we can just design and fly. Just design and fly, stay out of our hair. And it was allowed. And now, all progress in aviation, by the way, this happens to be an old dorky one. The stuff, the new ones look like jets. All progress in aviation, including carbon fiber, has occurred in light sport aviation. The government allowed that in an industry that you can actually crash and burn. So why am I not allowed to build a stair, which is not going to crash and burn? Why can't I build a house that isn't going to crash and burn? Okay? So what we need to do is actually bring examples like this. And so actually it does occur. We can have creativity. So studying this is going to be one of our pilot projects, as is actually identifying buildings that do not meet code, but do not meet code sufficiently that nobody makes a mistake. Do you know what Vonderman is doing in Europe? Hans Vonderman is the traffic engineer that has taken very big streets in Holland and in London and removed all the signage, all the lights, all the stop signs, and there's no paint on the ground, nothing. You enter and you're on your own. Okay? No signage. You know what's happening? Traffic flows more smoothly, no one gets hit, and everything works better. This lecture, actually his disciple lectured at the CNU. What happens is when you break the code enough so that people are careful, nothing happens. And this is what you find in stairs like this. And this is a whole type of study, this is a whole type of endeavor that really deserves attention. What is it that we can do that actually can make very small units? Because you can't build a small unit anymore unless you build a stair like this. You can't. You're not going to have the stair that actually takes, And so that is going to be an initiative. And this is the last one I'm going to show. Okay. This is the G. An amazing machine. I believe it was, I don't know who it was, I think somebody said that this is the vehicle that won the Second World War. This is the vehicle that did everything. I'm reading an article on it, and it was so light. Everything was perfectly designed. This is what we have now. Okay, these are our Humvees. They cost 50 times as much. They all this money. You know who's beating these guys? Guess who's beating these guys? These guys. You get the cheapest truck, you get some used 50 caliber Russian jaw, machine gun, and you can take on any Humvee, you can take on the Marines. There's a lot going on. This is brilliant stuff, by the way. These guys, whatever their ideology, are really lean. Amazingly lean. You know, look at the truck catalogs, and you know, within your Jeep, you know, a Ford 150 will do it. And that's the kind of thinking that we're up against. And I think when people actually, and you read more about it, we're up against a lot of people, not just in warfare, but in economics, that are very lean. More companies are opening now in Panama than are here, because you can get a permit there faster. They have a law that we want to study, I think it's called law number 93, that allows you very quickly to get permits there. So you have two places that are stable, etc., and it takes forever to get a permit in Miami, and it takes a week to get a permit in Panama. They're absolutely stealing our lunch. Just the same way that Alabama got Airbus. Why does Alabama get Airbus? Why did Mobile get Airbus? Why didn't Florida, with all of its technical universities, its wonderful weather, its airstrips, get Airbus? I asked them. Because they couldn't get a permit. They couldn't get a permit in time. In fact, in Florida, you can't even get a permit to be a supplier to Airbus. And that's why Alabama and places like that are actually getting places. And if we say, it's all education, it's all education, it's all education. No, guess what? It's not education. Education is mobile. You want an engineer, you build Airbus where you can get a permit within a couple of years, and the engineers will move there. It's a real error to think that we're going to educate a better workforce, and that workforce will go anywhere where it is. There's all this stuff going on that the more you learn, it just doesn't make any sense. And I think that one of the things, probably the next generation of Lean, is to actually go after the real, you know, a lot of this belief system that we're investing in and simply is not going to test out. Okay, that's the last slide. I don't think it's, is there time for questions? He's part of the Lean initiative. He was at the CNU presentation. He's trying to figure out how do you make townhouses possible, feasible economically. One of the things that happens when you assume high rises is that you can't build a townhouse. Nobody tried to make a townhouse impossible, right? Nobody said no townhouses. But the thing is, when you're thinking of dinosaurs, you can't conceive of mammals. And so Andrew, who's actually potentially a pretty big developer, is more interested in doing small things like townhouses. So I think the answer is that's one of them, what you're doing. And I actually find that Miami itself, the play here, is not going to be making the buildings, you know, we've got this situation with the condos, it is what it is. I think that the amazing thing that I find about Miami is the immigrants. You know, our immigrants, the diversity of our immigrants, this is where you study them. If you go to Texas, where I also work, they're all one kind of immigrant, right? They're all from Mexico, right? When you come here, you get immigrants of all types. You get the Haitian immigrants, you get the, you know, the mix is much greater here, and they come from different cultural systems. And I think the idea of enabling immigrants to start their own businesses and build their own buildings and not just work for other people, which is what we have them do. They all work for other people. Everybody, so many of the immigrants here are completely overqualified. overqualified for what they're doing. They should be running businesses instead of just working for other people. And I think that's what excites me about Miami. That's where we can learn that here. And we're going to do one of our initiatives in the night. This is a night city, and we're going to work in other night cities to do different things. But here, I think we're going to emphasize on the immigrants. Problem is that the minute you start daylighting things like that, the gray market, they're terrified that the bureaucrat's going to come and bust them. You know, there really is a problem talking about it. You can't just say, oh, there's this wonderful business here that's a kind of underground business, because they really won't tell you. So we don't know how to do that yet. Okay. Spread the word.